Okay, good evening. You join us in 1936, where we've just fought off the. Anyway, so today we're going to talk about inflation. Originally, the topic was going to be the third of the trifecta of silly things in the gaming industry, but I thought we'd talk about something more lighthearted, and so inflation. Uh, anyway, so inflation. What is it? Inflation is if we take the very basic approach, it's this idea that something that was worth, say, $10 today is going to be worth $11 tomorrow. And that means if you make $10 today, you should spend it today. Otherwise, tomorrow you can't afford the $11 item. But why do central banks target inflation? And why is inflation necessary? Well, excellent question. And I know someone's going to argue with me about that. But the idea is, before we talk about inflation, let's first talk about deflation. And so deflation is, exactly the opposite of that. When your $10 item today is going to be worth $9 tomorrow, and that sounds great, doesn't it? It means I can wait today if it's something non-critical. I can wait today until tomorrow, and then spend $9 instead of $10, and therefore I save myself $1. I can go to the dollar store and buy something else. And that sounds great, except what happens when everybody does that, and what happens when everybody does that for a sustained period of time? Then things become suddenly quite interesting, right? Because we run into our old friend supply and demand. I think we've talked about supply and demand. Let me just quickly look that up. I'm fairly certain we did. Oh yeah, sometime a long time ago. Yes. When we talked about universal basic income. Anyway, so supply and demand, right? And that's the issue, because if everybody in the country is no longer buying, things, lawnmowers, dishwasher, well, I'm talking about physical products, but maybe something more digital, like, say, video games. If nobody's buying video games all of a sudden because they know this game will be cheaper in about a year. Actually, that's a bad example because they usually are. No, let's use something else. Let's say things like a white label goods, so dishwasher, blah blah blah, all those good things. If everyone stops buying it, then suddenly demand craters, or demand craters, and the people who depend on whose livelihoods depend on making those things suddenly can't afford to make them anymore, or right, because nobody's buying their crap, and therefore entire swaths of the economy will shut down. Actually, that's a good point. Let me just add something for research later. Deflation in COVID-19. Anyway, deflation in COVID-19 in 2020 is actually not as bad as we thought, which is interesting, but we'll get to that in the future. So anyway, so deflation essentially then becomes a self-sustaining prophecy, because since everybody wants to wait till the future to buy stuff, goods have to become cheaper, and then to the point where it actually drives a lot of producers out of business, because they cannot afford to either hire people, or they cannot afford their raw materials anymore because their margins were really low. And And so that's why we cannot have deflation, because deflation is the one thing, one macroeconomic thing that can truly ruin a country in, you know, a year, a couple months even. And so that's why central banks, or rather that's why generally we want a little bit of inflationary effect to incentivize people to buy today, right? If I know that my $10, that for the same $10 I'll get just a little bit less in a year, usually about 2% less, or we hope 2% less, then it incentivizes us to buy today. And so that's why I said 2% earlier, because the central banks, modern central banks, tend to follow the 2% rule for targeting consumer goods inflation, simply because that seems to have been a rather nice number where consumers aren't too afraid of inflation, and so don't go out and just like buy every roll of toilet paper they can find. And they're also, not, they understand that it's also not a deflationary, which means that they're not going to hold on to their money to buy something in the future. So if we want 2% inflation, does that mean we want more? And the answer is a very firm no, because technically more inflation does really weird things to the economy, right? If we look at some examples in the past, such as in the very near past, such as Venezuela, where the bolivar was going on this crazy little jaunt and having inflation in the trillions of percentages, suddenly money has no value. And so inflation, how do I explain this? Inflation benefits people who take out loans, because then their loans are cheaper. And so that, I hope that makes sense, because if I take out a loan for, say, 3% today for $1,000, but inflation itself is at 6%, then technically, only very technically and only very hand-wavily, I have essentially gained 3% by simply having that money in cash in my pocket and return and repaying that $100 or $1,000, I forget which one I said, in a year's worth of time, right? And so that essentially means that when we have the higher our inflation is, the more the room there is for people to have shenanigans within that system. But also it means that whatever we earn today is just not worth much in the near future, and that's terrible for savings, that's terrible for planning, that's terrible for everyone in basically every single way. So that's what excuse me. And so that's why modern central banks tend to target inflation at 2%, because 2% is low enough that the wages earned today aren't completely useless in 2 to 5 years, but it's also high enough that we aren't likely to say, oh gosh, if it's going to be worth about the same in 2 to 5 years, maybe I should hold on to it, right? So it's that delicate balance between trying to make sure that the economy runs and that people who have money will spend that money, and making sure that the money is still worth some amount when in the near future. So, I completely forgot what I was going to say. Target 2%, blah blah. No, I think that's. Oh no. Right. So, why is inflation necessary? No, we've talked about the psychological effects, but inflation is also necessary for a whole bunch of other things, and that's interest rates, right? Because if there is absolutely no inflation and there's absolutely no change in the value of money, then that makes the entire economy really, really weird and really, really susceptible to shocks. And really the best example we have for this is thousands and thousands of years of human history where, you know, for the longest time, well, not the longest time, but as our economies developed for a long time, we were on such thing as a gold standard, which meant that every country could only have as much money as they had in gold, and therefore there was an upper limit to the amount of, I guess, let's call it, I don't want to talk about M0, M1. Let's just call it, every country can only print so much paper money. Let's go with that. And so therefore, if you can only print so much paper money, but there is more demand for that money, right? If we go back to our old friend supply and demand, if there's more demand for that money, then what happens? Well, things tend to get kind of fucky, right? If I want money because I think this is worth more, well, should I raise prices? Of course I should raise prices. But if I raise prices because I think the thing I made is awesome and everyone will want to pay that price for it, then that becomes a zero-sum game compared to everything else in the economy. And broadly speaking, then when the economy's essentially saturated all of the money, new things would have to eat into the profits of old things. Not just profits, but you get the point. Would have to eat into the money supply of other things. And that makes the entire economy really, really susceptible to essentially interference and makes it very unstable. And so that's why when everything collapsed, when the gold standard collapsed and the world went over to using the US dollar as a backstop, it gave us quite a while of wonderful economic growth, along with a whole bunch of other issues. But we'll talk about those in the future. So that's why, right? Because the US no longer had to print only the amount of US dollars as they had in gold. Essentially any debt that was issued by the US government is de facto considered printed money because it's no longer backed by anything but the idea of the United States of America. And I mean, modern currency is based on this concept of trust because it has to be, right? Because if I wanted to bartering is easy. I think my goat is worth, I don't know, 15 carrots and 3 potatoes and half a pig. Well, then you barter and barter until you get that. But money essentially makes that much more efficient, but it works on trust. And the trust in our modern age is in the US Federal Reserve and the US government for printing money. So obviously when my boy, the 45th president of America, messes around with that just a little bit, using the economic power that underlies the US dollar to do all sorts of interesting and let's just go with interesting things, then that faith in the US dollar is shaken. And that's why we see both the euro, the Chinese yuan, and actually just probably mostly those two retrench and try to good job retrench and try to try to make more of the world work in their own currencies, because that means that they're not susceptible to these wild swings in policy that might underlie the changes in the US government. Oh, 15 minutes. Sorry, back to inflation. So, and if inflation becomes easier once we move away from the gold standard, simply because now we can print however much we want to aim for that inflationary target of 2%, to incentivize people to spend, and to incentivize people to essentially just, be part of society and use their money to buy themselves nice things now, instead of waiting to buy themselves nice things 5 years in the future. And that's kind of important for the society as a whole, right? So that's what this is about. But yeah, we're at 16 minutes. In conclusion, inflation is good in moderate terms, actually, and moderate, by moderate I mean 2. And download Firefox. Please don't use Google Chrome. Please use Firefox.